I'll just take 10 minutes or so to discuss the article, and please feel free through that. We would like to have it as interactive as possible, so feel free to comment, unmute yourself, or have anything in the chat box. So as Nick, this is the case that we started with, and you have got that evidence-based medicine session during either your medical or the GB training, and you remember that you would like to help that patient. So you went to the PubMed and tried to search for an article, and you found that this just published systematic review in the PMG. So we will try to critically analyze it or break it down. And by that, we will ask ourselves 4 questions. What's the key question in this article, and whether that's relevant to our clinical question, the case study? And then whether that study, the result of this study, valid or not? Can we trust the result? And then what's the result? Try to analyze the result, interpret the finding. And finally, with the help of the committee, the expert committee here, we try to, whether that patient is helpful for my patient and in clinical practice. So to start with the first question, what's the key question of the article? And a helpful framework is to try to, what's the population? What's the intervention? What's the control or comparator? And what's the outcome that have been addressed? And usually that can be, you can have this information from the title or the abstract. So what's the population that have been studied in this review?
So adults receiving primary healthcare?
Yep. So it's in the objective is other adult with obesity in primary care setting. So adult with obesity and in primary care. And the intervention is from the title, behavior weight management interventions. So it's non-pharmacological interventions. And that's compared to, it's no treatment here, again in the abstract, either no treatment, attention control, or minimal intervention. And the outcome for that, the primary outcome is weight change at 12 months. So at 1 year, whether there's any weight change or not. So all that's the question can be found in the abstract and the title. If you go in details in the article you found in table 1, that's nicely articulated what the question with the inclusion exclusion criteria. But in general, that's the question. The population is adult with obesity in primary care. Intervention is the weight management, behavior intervention, non-pharmacological, compared to no intervention, no treatment, attention control, or minimal intervention, and the outcome weight change at 1 year. So the second question, whether we can trust the result. So are we all happy with the question? Are you all agree with that? It's the sort of question that you found while reading the article. Okay. I'll take the silence as agree. So for whether we can trust the result or not. So there's a nice a rabbit tool to critically appraise systematic review, which is called whether we have faith on this systematic review, which is F for finding, A for appraisal, I for included, and T for total, the evidence, and the H for heterogeneity. Which is kind of, you can rapidly tell whether that's, we can trust the evidence or not. And we will use that to critically appraise this article. So for the F, the faith, it's important that this review find all the relevant evidence about this question. And we specifically are looking about whether they have searched multiple databases, whether they use a mix between a free text word and index term, and whether they have no limitation, language limitation, or publication date limitation, and whether they have did an extra effort about searching the gray literature or clinical trial registries. So looking at usually this kind of information, you find this information in the method section, and usually have it subheading as search strategy or the searches. So here in the searches, what do you think about this finding? Did the authors did reasonable effort to find all the relevant studies about this question? So did they search multiple databases? So it seems that they search at least 3 databases: the Cochrane, the PubMed Midline, and the Psychic for the sick info. And they have used in the next, if you looked at the data, the supplementary files, it seems like a very detailed search strategies, including this index term, which is kind of a tagging for the publication, as well as free text word. So these kind of mesh terms, and here's some of the free text word that they have used. And if there's any limitation for the English language, so I think a little bit the complexity in this review that they have used some of the finding from previous systematic review for the US Preventive Service Task Force. And in that review, they limited the search for English language articles. But again, in this review, they screened also the excluded studies to find all those literature. I think so. They found they do that extra effort to include all the articles, regardless of the language or the date. And they also screened the reference list of previous reviews and include trials.
Is this why, do you think, that the date range in the methods is from 2018 to 2021? Is it because it's a kind of an update of that previous review? That was the kind of only thing that I was wondering about the finding.
Yep. So that's because of the update for that review. And here's the kind of the extract from that previous review, which is also searching multiple databases and also kind of thorough. But again, I think that's the one limitation in that previous review, that's limited to the English language, which is, again, that's raised the concern about language bias, because there's some evidence that those randomized trial that's found there's no effect, not significant finding, try to be published in local journals with local languages. And that, so if we limit to the English language, we will kind of systematically bias to more positive finding. So overestimate the effect size. But overall, I think that's a very minor thing. So overall, I think that's, they try to find all or most of the relevant research articles on this topic. So are you all happy with defining the relevant evidence? Okay. Okay, then next one about the appraisal, whether they appraise the finding, because we understand that the randomized trial, they are all not all the same. So there are low quality, high quality. So it's important to assess the risk of bias. And here the author again assess the risk of bias with the standard tool, the Cochrane risk of bias tools. And here the domain about randomization, the selection bias, the measurement bias, the main kind of sources of bias in these randomized trials. I think that's the standard practice. So any comment about the appraisal? It's not because one of the co-author in the call, that's I trying. It's a great article. There's not a lot to critique.
If you want to put me in a breakout room while you discuss it, I can come back later.
No. It's a great article there. I tried hard to find anything to critique. And for the inclusion, whether this included the right type of studies. So they included randomized control trial, which is kind of the expected study design for an intervention question. And I think the inclusion criteria from clinical point of view, I think that's reasonable inclusion criteria with the obesity, the age range, the body mass index, all of that I think reasonable, as well as the intervention. Any comment about the inclusion criteria, eligibility criteria?
No, it seems to be important that it's not, it goes well beyond GP delivered or primary care doctor delivered interventions. A whole lot range of different types of health professionals or people could do this. Health coaches who may not be trained health professionals, but it's in a primary care setting. I think that's the key thing, rather than someone who's separate from primary care delivering it. I think that was the idea, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, that you wanted to have it actually delivered from the primary care context.
Yeah, that's right, Nick. I'm actually a qualitative researcher, so I had no input into the stats or anything, but this was the part that they got my help with about what is primary care. So we use that definition there of it being somewhere you could go as a first point of contact, so you didn't have to have a referral in the community, and that you have the opportunity for that ongoing comprehensive healthcare. And like the whole background to the paper is Claire Madigan, who's based in the UK. They did this systematic review for the NHS, really, to try and inform what sort of things the NHS should be funding for weight management. So that's the reason why the review happened.
Yep. So that's for the inclusion. So again, the totality and heterogeneity, I think that we can discuss them together. So whether they total up the results with this appropriate summary tables and plots, and whether they have discussed the heterogeneity and try to explain the heterogeneity. And again, I think they did the standard by they tried to summarize, synthesize the evidence when appropriate. They measured the heterogeneity with the I-square, which is kind of explain the differences between the studies that cannot be explained by the chance only. And they did kind of funnel plots for small study effect or publication bias. And they summarize the study. They have table 1 for characteristic of included studies, and they have a few of these force plots that we will discuss in the results. And they also try to explain the heterogeneity with some pre-planned subgroup analysis as well, that we will also explain. So they try to do subgroup analysis based on the who delivered the intervention, about the intensity of the delivery, and the country where the study, the location of the trial, and also the risk of bias sensitivity analysis for the risk of bias, overall risk of bias assessment. So any comment about, I think that's the kind of a summary of the critical analysis of the methodology. So the question, can we trust the results and go, can we trust the review and go to the result to try to break down, interpret the results? Any comments? Yeah. So let's go. So as I mentioned, there are previous reviews. So they take they screen the included studies and as well as the excluded studies at the full text from the previous review. And they included 22 from that previous review. And from the new search, they included 14. So that with a total of 36 trial included in this analysis or in this review. And I think it's also important to look at the characteristic of include trials, and they have a very nice table for the characteristic of include trials, included some details about the intervention and the intensity of the intervention, who delivered the intervention, and if there's any training for the staff provided to be able to deliver the intervention, kind of the tighter, what's the details of the intervention, which is, I think, important for clinicians to be able to apply these results in a clinical practice. So these trials, the intervention range from 1 session to several sessions, and from the follow-up from 1 year to 3 years. For the risk of bias, I think most of the included studies, as here, either unclear risk of bias or high risk of bias, only a few of them low risk of bias, which is kind of a limitation for the evidence available to review. And the majority in the randomization, or most of those high risk of bias because of the randomization. So for the primary outcome, which is the change in weight at 1 year. So here's the first plot. And that's include 27 trials, about 8,000 participants. And as you can see here, all the list of the trials, the mean change in the intervention group, the standard deviation of change, and the number of participants in the intervention group, similar to that, the comparator group, and the mean difference observed for each trial. And at the end, the total here, this is the total, the pooled effect estimate, which is a reduction in the weight of about 2.3 kg. And that could range from a reduction of 1.5 kg to up to 3 kg. And that's statistically significant, as it hasn't like touched that line of no difference. And also the p-value here is statistically significant. But the heterogeneity is a little bit in the high range, more than 80%, 88%. And the test for statistical significance of this heterogeneity is also statistically significant. So there's quite significant differences between these studies. And that could be because of the population, could be because of the intervention, all that details, who deliver the intervention, the intensity of the intervention delivery. All that can attribute to that high heterogeneity. So any comment about this primary outcome?
There were two things there I thought Lau's Kieran here. The first was that there seemed to be a bimodal, if you looked at it just by the numbers, there was a group that was sort of 7 to 10, 12 kilos, then nothing in between, and then 2 to 4 kilos. There seemed to be quite a split if you look at the forest plot. My understanding though with that heterogeneity is that it's the random effects model that they use to assess the combined results on the primary outcome question. Using that random effects model, isn't that supposed to essentially statistically wash out some of that heterogeneity in terms of understanding where the number lies?
So
it was something I couldn't quite get in my head exactly, because it seemed so strong, and then I understood that there was this random effects model, but I don't really know how that would influence what I'm reading there.
So I think the random effects model is just that the assumption that the true effect for each of these trials could be different. So it's not all have the same one true effect, but it can't remove that variation. What they have done to try to explain that this heterogeneity or difference between the studies is that they do that kind of pre-planned subgroup analysis. So try to subgroup these studies based on who delivered the intervention, the intensity of the delivery of the intervention, and also where the study have happened. And they found that some of these could be significant. For example, who delivered the intervention that's kind of statistically significant subgroup, medical compared to non-medical, and also the intensity of the delivery. So the more sessions delivered, the more the weight reduction happened. That could be, maybe we can go to that, these results. So here the result of the subgroup analysis based on who deliver the provider. So for example, here the nurse led, the GP led, non-medical, and other practitioner. And they found that this subgroup differences, the differences in the effect of the intervention on the weight change, on the primary outcome, is statistically significant based on these subgroups. So that could explain the heterogeneity, one of the factors that can explain the heterogeneity. So another factor is the number of contact. So they do subgroup 11 or less contact, 12 or more contact. And that's another also statistically significant factor that could explain the heterogeneity. But none of those completely explain the heterogeneity, like partially explain the heterogeneity. I don't know if that's answer your question or address your comment.
Yes, it does. Yeah, I was trying to work out whether it was a purely statistical phenomenon that we're using, or like you say, it's actually a subgroup analysis. It's more useful.
So I think I talked a lot. Maybe I'll stop here, and maybe if you'd like to go to some of the secondary outcome, we can after the panel maybe if anyone.
Thanks, Zoe. I guess I'm interested in people's comments and bringing Liz here on, you know, well, one of the things that really struck me was the number of contacts that was required to show that benefit. And I'd be really interested in his comments on that and the practicality of that and the, I guess, sustainability of it. But I also wonder if people might want to comment about, or others might want to comment, well, it's, and I did, you know, was picked up in the article, it's 2.3 kilos or something. I mean, it's not a huge amount of weight. And a lot of patients we see say they want to lose 15 kilograms or 20 kilograms or something. But I do note the point the authors made that it's still a useful amount of weight from a health perspective. But could Liz, we bring you and get your comment on both of those things, if that's okay?
Yeah, for sure.
You're on mute, Liz.
I am. Can you hear me now? That's so weird. I was on mute. Anyway, the number of contacts, I agree, Nick, and you know, we're all under the pump in the clinic at the moment, and probably the thought of seeing people with obesity at least 12 times, you know, over the course of a year kind of probably fills people with a bit of panic. And I think the reason, I mean, it makes sense that, you know, more frequent contact, you've got more input from your treating team, a bit more probably accountability to an external party, if we're thinking about behavioural interventions. But I think your point around the amount of weight loss, I mean, compared to your case study at the front there, where we've, you know, 15 kilos over 6 weeks versus, you know, around 2 kilos over 12 months, it's a pretty stark difference, isn't it? And when we're looking at these small amounts of weight loss, it's really more than a public health intervention, really, because if you look at it at a population level, if we get 2 kilos off people at a population level, that probably makes a big difference for health. For the individual, I mean, I always struggle thinking about weight loss and health and obesity. I mean, definitely the more I learn about obesity, you know, definitely I see it as a chronic disease. The body's wired to keep weight on. But it would be really unfortunate if we think, okay, well, we're just thinking about the kilos. And although that this paper really does focus very closely in on kilograms and has that as the primary outcome, we weren't able to unpack other health measures like blood pressure and sugar control and things like that. And I think it's just worthwhile pointing out to everyone that even if you don't have a weight loss, if people become more physically active, particularly people who are highly sedentary, we know their health outcomes are better. So part of this paper focusing in completely on weight is a little bit against what I know about people and weight and health and activity. But it's when you're doing a systematic review, you're kind of hamstrung by the outcomes that have been picked by the studies that have already been done. And it's only very, very recently in obesity research with medications that we've seen anything beyond weight in people's primary outcome measures. So I agree, Nick, with everything you've said.
We might bring Kieran in here for his comments. And I think, I mean, when you see this sort of review, you'd always hope you're going to see, well, this sort of intervention works. It works most of the time and it's practical. But as you point out in this, Liz, you don't really zero in on, you can't, on unpacking which interventions were the most effective. And as people have noted in the chat, there's a fair bit of heterogeneity in the results. And as Paul rather humorously pointed out, it was the study by Lean that had the best outcome. Very witty, Paul. You know, it is quite hard to know what does this mean. Maybe Kieran, I'll ask you to comment, and I'm sort of wondering, well, what does it mean for this patient as well, that we've, you know, because he's got to stop the Saxenda at some point, and what happens then? You know, as always another challenge. You know, do people just go back up again or beyond what their previous weight was? So, Karen, for comments.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I think, Liz, just to reiterate, I think you've hit the nail on the head that what's so useful about this paper is if we have to look at populations of people, which I understand the NHS being, one of the people interested in this work, that's their level. And then there's little old me sitting in my clinic with 25 patients booked that day, 100 for the week, and several thousand for the year, where one of the biggest recurring difficult problems that the person sits down and asks me about is, how do I do something about this excess weight? And I think the first lesson for me, Nick, was that you've got to stop thinking about adiposity as just an energy issue. Adiposity has a profound role in endocrine, in reproductive health, in psychological health, in the immune system. Fiona Wood the other day talked about the possibility that there's a role for skin, and that will indeed involve fat, probably in cancer. So adiposity has this sort of profound relationship with the whole person. And by thinking about adiposity in its many roles, we can start to think about, well, what matters in terms of what changes. And, I reiterate what Liz says, is that weight loss isn't necessarily the thing. We all know that it's particularly the visceral fat, which is quite problematic for cardiovascular and stroke and other health issues. So people can look very lean on the outside, but have the wrong kind of adiposity, which is very dangerous. And, I think we're pretty clear on that with the evidence. So in my clinic, when it wasn't Sextender, because the evidence for that wasn't super huge, but when semaglutide came out, I decided to take the bull by the horns, as it were, and with a very high degree of disclosure to my patients, we as a group embarked on a sort of unstructured trial, as you might call it. And so I had 120 patients on semaglutide within the first 3 or 4 months of it coming through the TGA approval. People more than happy to pay $400 a month. And we found a whole bunch of interesting things. The first is the cost was actually neutral or positive for the patient. Because of the profound loss of appetite, most patients reported massive savings in food bills. So they were actually spending less per month by spending $400 on this drug than they were on the food that they'd been eating because of their intense hunger. That was a very common comment. The second one was, Nick, as you pointed out, I had patients losing 10, 15 kilos in the first 2 months. Weight loss they'd never experienced in their life. And the issue became not how great is this drug, but how do we look to sustain this? What are the opportunities that this weight loss we've obtained with this drug? How do we translate that into something which is more sustained? Because the Americans were showing that once you stop the drug, you tend to start to regain the weight. And that's a big commitment, $400 a month for most people. But then my mind turned to the fact that I was spending thousands of dollars a month on diabetics whose blood sugars wouldn't shift because they weren't doing the right things. They weren't engaged in behavior change. There were a whole bunch of things they weren't doing, they weren't required to do in order to access subsidized drugs that were having very minimal impact on their health outcomes in terms of HbA1c and kidney function, et cetera. So I started to say, well, hang on, why are we taking a pejorative view about obesity and access to extremely effective but costly drugs when there's a whole range of health conditions that we happily spend thousands on through the public purse with actually very marginal improvements. And so, that got me starting to talk to my patients about what mattered to them. And it became clear to me that weight loss isn't about health outcomes primarily for patients. It's about that sensation of feeling good in their skin. And that has a whole range of possible benefits beyond whether or not they've got less cancer risk or diabetes risk or cardiovascular risk, which is important to us. And so that's how I sort of came to this, is to understand that what it means for the patient is as valuable, but maybe different from what it means to me. And that has a value. And that value is beyond whether or not this drug is going to cost the public purse $10 billion or not. It's actually a question we have to deal with.
Thanks, Kieran. And maybe I'm noticing in the chat that there's been Lauren and others have been commenting on just raising the topic of being overweight and obese with patients. And maybe that goes a little bit to what Kieran's been talking about what do people care about and how do we have that discussion? Lauren, would you like to kind of come in here and bring your views to the group?
Nick, that's a very big ask of me.
I know.
I don't have any magical answers, although I would, you'd think after researching in this topic for so many years you would. I'd like to really congratulate Liz and her team on what they've done. They've clearly brought together a very broad group of studies, and not an easy task to do, especially with the rigor that sits behind it. So I think they've done an excellent job. And I was reflecting in my mind as Loe was going through the paper about how a policymaker could use this. There would be far smarter people than I that would say whether a 2.3 reduction in weight loss is worth it at a population level. Many would say it's possibly too small. I'm sure some would say it's enough to at least get people on the journey. Maybe there's a Hawthorne effect as well over the long term, but that's why I popped the question in the chat about the ethical or moral question, because I've just seen it so much lately about whether, as Rosie said, well-meaning health professionals should even raise this topic. It really pulled me up in my tracks the more that I've heard this lately, not from an efficacy perspective or an intervention perspective, but it's been since COVID. And I think that raises fundamental challenges for primary care about what are we here to do. Are some topics really off limit? I would argue no. I would say there's always, if the intention is well-meaning and it's for improved health, I think that we need to do so much more research and education and work unpacking how we can do this in a way that's truly person-centered, not stigmatizing, that's going to help with self-empowerment and self-determination and going to have a positive impact, because the potential negative impact could really lead us to a dark place. So Nick, I don't have any magical answers, but that's my thoughts on this. And well done again to Liz and the team.
Thanks, Lauren. Paul's commenting about the framing this and in terms of blood pressure as well. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Do you want to speak to that, Paul?
Sorry, just trying to find the unmute. No, I was just trying to think. I mean, it seems a lot of effort. That's why I was thinking of it per sessions. How much weight loss might be worthwhile depending upon the goals, as many people have been mentioning. So if you're looking at the weight loss for blood pressure, you might be thinking, well, 5 to 10 sessions is going to gain me, 2 or 3 kilograms, perhaps. And that translates roughly to, it's about 2 millimeters of mercury per 1 kilogram of weight loss. Yeah, so clinically that might be worthwhile, but I think you have to then think this isn't just a couple of sessions. The person's actually got to be willing to put in those numbers of contacts, and can we get access for the person to that number of sessions, etc.
Back to you, Liz. I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Nick. I recently found the raise hand button after all these years on Zoom, but it's a good one. I just wanted to go back to Kieran's point about people's goals. And I think in obesity research, and Lauren's touched on it there too, that it's actually a really kind of fraught area. I mean, if we had, say, people who would say that they're fat activists and whatever listening to this conversation, they would have a very different perspective on bringing up weight and goals of care and that sort of thing. One thing I'm wondering about is whether when we see our patients and they say, I just really want the weight off, the role of weight stigma and kind of societal pressures around what is an acceptable body and those kind of pressures, and whether we as GPs can sometimes kind of play into that weight stigma and the body shaming. I think Lauren actually sent me some Instagram posts the other day where, there were people detailing their Mamma Mia, that, the Mamma Mia magazine people, they have a current kind of ad campaign out there about body shaming, and a lot of it's around GPs fat shaming people is their take on it. So I just don't, Kieran, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that around, stigma and body shame, and whether we inadvertently kind of perpetuate and add to that by focusing on the kilos? Again, sorry, it's not an easy question.
But I think that's it's the key, and it's what my patients taught me, was that I was very concerned about these primary preventative health concerns about cardiovascular health, diabetes, etc. That was very important to me. And what I heard back was, well, yes, that's all well and good, but I am breathless when I walk from the car. I can't get up the 2 flights of stairs anymore to my house. I find it really difficult. Not I don't like, wearing swimwear at the beach, or I just wish I looked good in this. That's not the kind of, I think that a lot of work by all those activists over a long period of time has helped people understand that it's not about the body ideal, but people are aware that there's something about what they're carrying which is materially affecting how they feel in their skin, is kind of how I put it in generic terms. And I was looking at, well, what can I do to help? And we looked at, exercise groups within the community, all these very different things. And then this drug came out, and it was, it was revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. Just people who've never lost weight for 30 years, losing 10 or 15 kilos. They didn't come back to me and say, oh, I look so good now. They just said, I just feel more comfortable. I can enjoy the experience of life a little bit easier because I'm less breathless, or, I can get down the road. I can spend time with my grandchildren and things like that. So that was very important for my understanding, was exactly what we were all saying, is that it's not actually about these, although they're important, that's not why people were coming to me. And they're really looking for that feeling good in their skin. And I guess that comes back to my point about what is the role of adiposity. And so, of course, I had a lot of women concerned about their fertility and things, all these really important things that mattered to them at this point in their life. And that's where we started the journey.
Let's bring Praveen in here. Yes, Praveen, yeah.
Thanks, Nick. I just wanted to say that, when I and Kieran were actually interacting with the final year medical students, it's so interesting to look at the perspectives of various clinicians when you are in that role, actually. And when you ask the students how they want to actually address it, they it's licensed only for diabetic patients. It's not for obesity. Yeah, but it's licensed for obesity, but we can't use it. There's restrictions on it. So that's what they say. So if you look at the patient groups, there are patients who are quite obese. They have sleep apnea, just like the classical patient, what you mentioned at the start of the presentation. And they would never, they probably would rarely actually raise the question of how do I lose weight. I get lots of patients in my clinic who are young. They actually have probably been recently delivered a baby, or they've just changed their weight from maybe about 45 kilos to 50 kilos. Doctor, can I have the drug? Because this is out in the press, and semaglutide has been quite famous of late, and we get loads of walk-ins asking for this. So it's quite interesting to see individual perspectives of the population. Body shaming, I think, is once upon a time topic rather than currently being so actively pursued by or seen by patients. They are actually looking at their own bodies and thinking that, oh, I've gained so much of weight now, so I need some help. Now this drug is out, so let me go and try it. So that has been the perspective what I've noticed. I totally agree with Kieran on that I think it's the endocrine, the adipose structure and everything, what we need to be looking more in detail. And I think it's very important to discuss in primary care about the prevention aspects as well. It's very, very important.
Yeah. Let's continue this discussion for a moment. One of the things I notice and primary is we're not very good at weighing and measuring people. Doctors in particular, I think, are particularly bad at it. We just don't get round to it for some reason. And we're certainly not very good at measuring waist circumferences. I remember when Mark Harris had a CRE at one point about overweight and obesity, and he said one of the reasons is doctors don't like putting their arms around the patient's waist, and they think the patient will be embarrassed and they'll be embarrassed. So you're meant to get them to twirl around the tape measure, apparently, so that they that's less embarrassing, and it's a good trick actually. But others might have comment. But I noticed Bryce Brickley in the chat said about language, and I think we've covered that. But Bryce, do you have any further comments on the sort of language that primary care practitioners? How do we start these conversations and avoid some of those pitfalls or traps that we're worried about?
Thanks, Nick. No, not much more to add, just that, yeah, if the real challenge is starting the conversation, some simple structured approaches and actual language for clinicians to use, would help GPs or other clinicians start that conversation.
Right. All right. Further comments on, I guess I would wonder, we're kind of reaching towards the end of our time. So going back in the sense to the case, and as Praveen and Kieran, this is not an unusual kind of thing. There's quite a lot of people, particularly those who've got a genetic predisposition perhaps to obesity, as Pacific Islander people tend to. How are we going to sustain, is there a strategy, Liz, that you came through about this sustaining that weight loss that might have happened through, that 15 kilos? Does anything in this study of yours that help us on that question?
This study was definitely about initial weight loss. So even though it was, some of the studies were up to 3 years, it was still at that initial weight loss. Weight maintenance is extremely difficult, and that's because the body is kind of wired to go back to its weight set point. And so again, it's not about people not, behaving properly or doing the right thing or all those kind of things. It's your body is wired to put weight on. It prefers to have the weight on. So this one doesn't. There are some big trials looking at weight maintenance, actually by Claire Madigan and some of the people on this paper. And they talk about things like regular self-weighing, food diaries, eating breakfast, all of those kind of things. There are some, but there are not anything huge in the weight maintenance space, and particularly around medications. People are really saying now that you might need to be on medications for a really long time. And that's, I guess, where cost comes into it, especially in Australia. So even though I study obesity, I've actually never in my life prescribed any of the medications, because I work in a clinic where just about everyone's unemployed and on a healthcare card, and they have absolutely no way they can afford the medications. And just as another equity issue is bariatric surgery is done 90% of the time in the private health system in Australia. So obesity management is a huge equity problem in Australia. And I actually think it probably does point to stigma around the condition, and that we still as a community think that obesity is something that someone did something wrong and that's their poor behavior, and that's why they have the weight. So therefore, we shouldn't put the public purse in. I think, Nick, I think it's Rosie Rosie Hamilton in the chat has just brought up around eating disorders, and just to really flag that there are people living in large bodies who have significant eating disorders, and we should always really screen people for disordered eating patterns, because in our minds we all think people with disordered eating will be in very slim bodies, but that's definitely not the case. That's a great point, Rosie.
Thanks, Liz. I guess another point that I remember that Baker Institute used to have on their website a sort of heat map of where the postcodes of people who are overweight and obese, and mapped to CIFA codes, matched to socioeconomic status. And it's such an extraordinary correlation and the other thing that they pointed out was over time that equity gap had got bigger, that people from lower SES had got more overweight and obese, and people from higher SES were smaller numbers. So that's and it goes back to Kieran's point when we're talking to medical students that obesity and overweight and obesity is so much a social phenomenon, a socioeconomic phenomenon, societal phenomenon, but has medical consequences, obviously health consequences. You know, I'm conscious we've got
Nick, if
5
I could
minutes.
just add there,
Yeah.
everyone's body is actually not their own. This is a very profound corruption of the understanding of what it means to be a human being. Your body is not your own. It's actually in a socio-cultural context. It represents and reflects its connections to the world around it. And, you know, we have allowed corruption of food resources for 2-3 generations now in a way that populations never had to deal with, along with all those equity and social injustices, which then drive this behavior. So I've always said, you know, obesity isn't about the individual. Obesity is an issue of culture. And it's because we have this screwy idea that our bodies are ours. Well, yes, but actually, no, they're not. They're actually they're a social phenomenon as well. And I learned that a lot living in that little community.
It's a very good point, Kieran. And when you read about the US about corn syrup being subsidized to the US farmers to grow corn, and then they're looking for something to do with it, so add it to all sorts of processed foods, you know, and the economics of that just go round, and how, yeah, so it kind of feeds into that point. I'm going to try and have to get a sense whether I own my body after this. I'm not sure. I feel a bit, not threatened, just a bit, don't know where the edges are. Okay, other comments from people who, because we've got about 2 minutes left before we wind up. Anything people have been wanting to say that they haven't had a chance to or haven't put in the chat yet? No? Okay, well, I think it's just, I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has. And as always, Loay has taken us through the article with great skill and helping us to understand what we look for in a quality systematic review. And Liz, you get gold stars all over, you and your team. You could find almost nothing wrong. Yes. Yeah, clap hands from Paul, yeah. And we're always looking for suggestions on topics for these journal clubs. This is not probably the last one for the year, though we are having a face-to-face event, aren't we, in conjunction with GP Gold Coast. Alex, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I would love to tell everyone about that. Unfortunately, though, and Laura Baxter's here as representative from GPGC, all of the registrations are closed, I believe. It was a very hot topic. It's on long COVID era and collaborating through that. So that's later this month at the RFCB. However, we do run 2 face-to-face events a year and 2 journal clubs a year at the moment. And I'd be very, very happy for people to email me, pop it in the chat, wherever, for topics that they'd like to see upcoming and that sort of thing as well. As well as if you'd like to be a member, check out the website. I can pop that into the chat as well for people to sign up, and you get regular updates on projects that we're part of and sponsoring or supporting, as well as those events as well. So yeah, thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Ellie. Yes, I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that the GP Gold Coast thing was it's fully subscribed, but thanks to Laura and GP Gold Coast for allowing us to be involved in that event, which should be a really, really good one. And yeah, so ideas about, Laura said that there has a wait list if people want to register for the wait list. Yeah. And yes, so suggestions on future topics, please send them to Ali or to myself. If you would like to be a formal member of GoldNet, then it's very easy. Just go to the website or send Ali an email, and it doesn't cost anything and there's no obligation. It's just being part of a community that's interested in research and the application of research to practice. So we're up on 7 o'clock and I promised we'd finish at 7. So I'm going to try to stick to that. Thanks again so much, Liz, Loay and Kieran for your input, and Ali for all the organisational work. And thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks, Ali. Well, we probably should all sign off because I think it's sort of home time. But thanks, and we'll catch up soon about, what next in terms of following up with people in case they've got suggestions and things for future topics.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yep. Okay.
Yeah,
see you later.
well shared and great organisation, Ali.
Thanks.
Thanks,
See you
Paul.
later. Right, bye.